Daniel chapter 4, beginning at verse 34. It says, "And at the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up mine eyes unto heaven, and mine understanding returned unto me, and I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him that liveth forever, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. And all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. And he doeth according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. None can stay his hand or say unto him, What doest thou? At the same time my reason returned unto me, and for the glory of my kingdom mine honor and brightness returned unto me, and my counselors and my lords sought unto me. And I was established in my kingdom, and excellent majesty was added unto me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all whose works are truth and his ways judgment. And those that walk in pride, he is able to abase." This morning I want to preach a message on the subject of the sovereignty of God. In our text, we find that the king has just gone through a great time of learning in God's way of bringing down somebody who is very, very prideful, very, very arrogant, someone who thought he was something great and something to be looked upon as fantastic. And we see Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Daniel as he had a dream in chapter 2. We find him taking that dream, missing the point of the dream, making a great image in chapter 3 that everyone was to worship and bow down to. We find God's protection over his people in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as they were thrown in the fiery furnace, and we find them as they were protected there. And then we find Nebuchadnezzar one day as he kind of thought about the greatness of all of his kingdom, and he says, look at all this. Look at these great things that I've done. And then God brought him down to a level that I reckon no king had ever been brought down to before. And the Bible tells us that there in chapter 4, and it says in verse 28, "All this came upon the king Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of 12 months, he walked in the palace of the kingdom of Babylon. The king spake and said, Is not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom by the might of my power, for the honor of my majesty? While the word was in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven, saying, O King Nebuchadnezzar, to thee it is spoken, the kingdom is departed from thee. They shall drive thee from men. Thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. They shall make thee to eat grass as oxen, and 7 times shall pass over thee, till thou know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will." Nebuchadnezzar thought he was great. Many a king has thought he was great. Many a kingdom has departed. Many a kingdom has fallen. And you go through the pages of history and you'll find that great kingdoms are gone. Great empires destroyed, divided up. Nebuchadnezzar lived to tell about it later. And he says, hey, there's something I want to say about God. All the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. He doeth according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say to him, what doest thou? Other kings learned their lesson as well, but they may not have spoken it this side of eternity. But I can tell you what, every king, every person, every knee will bow to the sovereign King of kings and Lord of lords. What do we mean about the sovereignty of God? Well, sovereignty means the supremacy of God. We mean the kingship of God. We mean the godhood of God. To say that God is sovereign, we mean that He is the Most High. To say that God is sovereign is to declare that He is the Almighty, the possessor of all power in heaven as well as in earth. None can defeat His counsels, none can thwart His purpose or resist His will. The sovereignty of God is the absolute, irresistible, and infinite. God says as He pleases, always as He pleases. Whatever takes place in time is but the outworking of that which He declared in eternity. That's the way A.W. Pink defined the sovereignty of God in his book by the same title. Everything about God is sovereign. His love, His grace, His mercy, His justice, His power, He is sovereign in everything. To say that God is sovereign and then to declare He is not sovereign in one of His attributes is to deny the absolute sovereignty of God, which is why we have to take time to define these words at the start of a message, because sometimes you talk to people and they'll say, yes, I believe in the sovereignty of God, but then you get to talking about them and the word means something different to them. Just like even an Arminian will speak of the grace of God, but it means something different to them than what it means to us and to the Scriptures. How wonderful it is to know that God is sovereign in everything. If you know the Lord today, it is great to know that God is all-powerful, that He is sovereign, that He is above all. To know that God's grace, that His love, it can't be changed by any outside influence. It can't be altered by anyone. It cannot be changed through time, or the devil and all of his powers cannot alter the decrees of God. There are a lot of different ways that we could go with a sermon like this, and with a lesson like this. With each one of these points of Bible doctrine, we just barely scratch the surface. But get into the Bible and start studying the sovereignty of God. Get into A.W. Pink's book on the sovereignty of God. Study these things out and really dig into it. It is a great blessing to really know of God's sovereignty. Today, for time's sake, we won't exhaust the subject. The mind can only take as much as the seat can endure. So we'll only go through God's God's sovereignty in His dealings. So I'd like to talk about, first of all, God's sovereignty in creation. God's sovereignty in creation. Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. I love Genesis. I love history. I love science. The Bible is truth when it speaks of these things. And God is sovereign in His creation. Before there was ever any creation, before He ever spoke the world into existence, before there was ever a human being on the earth, before there was ever a fish, before there was ever a dinosaur, before there was ever an angel, God was sovereign. There was a sovereign God before any of this. God has always existed, even before there was ever any time or space. To imply that God was not sovereign, then is to imply that there was no God. God's sovereignty in creation is something that most folks will admit. Back then there was nobody to stay His hand or say to Him, "What doest thou?" There was a sovereign God, the sovereign God, who created the universe without any helpers, without any opinions, no advice, nothing. God spoke it into existence in 6 literal days, creating something that was very good out of nothing. Only a sovereign God could do that. He didn't need to be like us when we make something. I'm not very good at stuff, but sometimes I'll try to build something. I'll need to go and first I'll need a good set of directions. And even then sometimes I mess it up. I get my directions, look at them, try to follow them. I'll get on YouTube, try to find somebody who's done it before. I might call somebody on the phone and say, "Hey, what does this mean?" I probably need some tools in order to get it made. God didn't need any of that. He needed no hammer. He needed no concrete. He needed no screwdriver to create this universe. He did it all with the power of His Word. In Proverbs chapter 16, Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 4. The Lord hath made all things for Himself, yea, even the wicked for the day of evil. God is sovereign in the creation of all things, everything. Even bumblebees and flies and mosquitoes, skunks. God's sovereign over all those things. Even the wicked for the day of evil. God is sovereign over all of that. Now we'll look at that for a little later, but realize that God created all things for Himself. All created for His glory and His pleasure. You can go on to the book of Revelation and you'll see that. Revelation 4 and 11. The question has been debated is, did God create this whole world, make this whole universe, and then leave it alone? Did He sovereignly create it and then just leave it to its own devices? Well, no, He did not. The ones who try to teach that are the Arminians, who admit God's sovereignty in creation, but deny it for most everything else. And then also the theistic evolutionists who try to tell us that, well, God created the world, God sparked the Big Bang, and then left it all to its own devices until, depending on who you talk to, some of them say he simply left it alone. Others say he intervened once more whenever he breathed the breath of life into some old monkey that had stepped out of a pile of goo when it was an amphibian or something else before. Those sorts of things are not taught in the Scriptures. These are fairy tales that come from men. Both of these groups believe that God was surprised when Lucifer fell, that he was shocked when Adam sinned at the Garden of Eden, but this is not the sovereign God of the Bible. This is not the sovereign God that we serve. If you go into the book of Psalms, chapter 103, Psalms 103 and verse 19. The Lord hath prepared his throne in the heavens, and his kingdom ruleth over all. His kingdom ruleth over all. God sovereignly rules over all. Present tense, not past tense. Not God up there wringing his hands together, hoping everything kind of comes together the way that he thinks it will. What chaos would this world be in if God was not in control? Why, if this world were left to chance, it is doubtful. It is unlikely that we would be here today. If our ancestors didn't destroy each other, the world itself, the planet, would have gone off course, either been burnt up by the sun or frozen over and lost out in space. The fact is that the universe could not be left alone. The question is, how sovereign is God over his creation? I believe that this is a very interesting study in and of itself in the book of Amos. Amos chapter number 4. What if I were to tell you that God is sovereign over the rain and the mildew? I believe that. I believe that. In the book of Amos, chapter 4, verse 7. And also, I have withholden the rain from you when there were yet 3 months to the harvest, and I caused it to rain upon one city, and caused it not to rain upon another city. One piece was rained upon, and the piece whereupon it rained not withered. So 2 or 3 cities wandered into one city to drink water, but they were not satisfied. Yet have ye not returned unto me, saith the Lord. I have smitten you with blasting and mildew, when your gardens and your vineyards, and your fig trees, and your olive trees increased. The palmer worm devoured them. Yet have ye not returned unto me, saith the Lord. I have sent among you the pestilence after the manner of Egypt. Your young men have I slain with the sword, and have taken away your horses, and I have made the stink of your camps to come up unto your nostrils. Yet have ye not returned unto me, saith the Lord. And we've got people in this world that think that earthquakes and hurricanes just happen willy-nilly. But God says he's in control of rain and mildew. God is also in control over he is sovereign, in control over irrational creatures. In the book of 1 Kings chapter 17, 1 Kings chapter number 17. Begin verse 2. The word of the Lord came unto him, saying, Get thee hence, and turn thee eastward, and hide thyself by the brook Cherith, that is before Jordan. And it shall be that thou shalt drink of the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to feed thee there. Irrational creatures. Birds. What do we call, what's another word for morons in our day? Bird brains. Not something you'd think of as very, very smart, but God is in control over these creatures. They're smarter than what we give them credit for. Why? Because there's a sovereign God who is working. You ever consider this? God's word says that there was a great flood. But before the flood, there were some animals that came to the ark. People, the scoffers, say, I didn't know we'd get all them animals there. Well, the fact is, Noah didn't do it. It was God. God did that. God put forth in these animals and sent them to the ark in this great migration. And you know what? He got it right too, because male and female, God's design. And some of them came with more than just the two, because God had a plan for that as well. For the offerings and so on and so forth. You see, God is sovereign over irrational creatures. And He knew how to make sure that the timing would be just right. So, slug made it there just at the same time as a mammoth. It's just the fact of it. God is sovereign over these things. And just in case anybody thinks that that's just an Old Testament kind of a thing, you can go into the New Testament, go into the book of Revelation, you'll see where God calls the birds of the air into a great feast when He'll destroy the armies of the earth in a great battle. He'll give them something to eat in that future event there. Proverbs chapter 16. Proverbs chapter 16. And folks don't like to know about this one, but it's a fact just the same. In Proverbs chapter 16 and verse number 9. A man's heart deviseth his way, but the Lord directeth his steps. God is sovereign over the people of this world. Now man's ideas, man's opinions, man's desires is that there's no king to rule over him. At least no sovereign king, no sovereign God, certainly not the God of the Bible. But the fact is, there is this God that I speak of, and He is true, and He is sovereign, even over the people of this world. And it doesn't matter your status either. Proverbs chapter 21, verse 1 says, The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord, as the rivers of water. He turneth it whithersoever He will. We find kings that great power, but God has used them for His own purpose and will. The book of Job, chapter 12, verse 23, further illustrates this. Job 12, verse 23. He increaseth the nations, destroyeth them. He enlargeth the nations, and straighteneth them again. And so we've seen through history empires rise. We've seen them fall. You go through history and you'll read of great empires. You read of the Byzantine Empire, the Roman Empire. You'll read of all sorts of things, empires, kings, great nations that have gotten large and have fallen. Why is that? Well, God's sovereign over all of these things. And they serve their purpose. They're done. The Bible speaks of Assyria as being the rod of his anger. We see how God used even the Roman Empire and the Greek culture. He used that to spread Christianity in the early days. God is sovereign even over the angels. In Acts chapter 12, Acts chapter number 12 and verse 11. When Peter was come to himself, he said, Now I know of a surety that the Lord hath sent his angel, and hath delivered me out of the hand of Herod, and from all the expectation of the people of the Jews. Sovereign over the angels. Angels are pretty powerful. But God's sovereign over them. God is also sovereign over Satan and the fallen angels as well. Book of Job, chapter number 1. Job chapter 1. Verse 6. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. The Lord said unto Satan, Whence comest thou? Then Satan answered the Lord, and said, From going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down in it. And the Lord said unto Satan, Hast thou considered my servant Job? There's none like him in the earth, a perfect and an upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil. Then Satan answered the Lord, and said, Doth Job fear God for naught? Hast not thou made an hedge about him, and about his house, and about all that he hath on every side? Thou hast blessed the work of his hand, and his substance is increased in the land. But put forth thine hand now, and touch all that he hath, and he will curse thee to thy face. And the Lord said unto Satan, Behold, all that he hath is in thy power, only upon himself put not forth thine hand. So Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord. God is sovereign over the devil himself. You know, they say a man's house is his castle. Don't know what that means, although sometimes I wish I had a moat out in front of my yard. I think that'd be kind of neat. Kind of protect my house from some things. But the fact is that God does indeed set up hedges around us, just like he did with Job. But every once in a while, I believe that God lifts his restraining hand and allows Satan to do some things. But that's the key. Satan can only do as much as he's allowed to do, no more. And why is that? Because God is sovereign. And that's one of the things that drives Satan crazy, and has ever since he was Lucifer, and fell when he began to desire to be the Most High. In the book of Judges, chapter 9, Judges chapter 9, verse number 23. Then God sent an evil spirit between Abimelech and the men of Shechem, and the men of Shechem dealt treacherously with Abimelech. So we see that God is sovereign over these things. The evil spirit was said to have come from God. In other words, God permitted it. God is sovereign over the universe. In Acts chapter 17, Acts chapter 17, verse number 28. Paul, when he went before the Athenians there on Mars Hill, there was all these monuments to gods, and the way I understand it in my studies, it was against the law for someone to introduce a new god without some sort of special permit. So Paul springboarded off of a monument to the unknown God. And he says, hey, I'm declaring to you this God that you don't know anything about. The God of the universe, the Creator, Him declare I unto you. Because y'all are too superstitious, too religious. And he told them about the sovereign God. In verse number 28, he says, for in Him we live and move and have our being. As certain also of your own poets have said, for we are also His offspring. We are talking about that God. Not the helpless God of Arminianism, not the clueless God of evolution, but the sovereign God of the universe, the God of the Bible. That's who we are preaching about. God is sovereign over the entire universe. You know, I think, because I've only got a little bit of time, and I've got two more points that I'd like to look at. I believe I'm going to cut this here, and we'll look at the rest of the subject, Lord willing, next week. Brother Justin, would you please pray for us?
Our Heavenly Father, we're thankful to be here, to have you as our